Thanks to all of you, brothers and sisters, for coming out. I hope we're going to have a discussion, a rich discussion about the underlying politics of 9/11. You know, whenever any of us have attempted to raise questions about the evidence pertaining to events like that of 9/11, we're immediately charged with being conspiracy mongers, and that is the generalized approach of authority whenever challenged with respect to their criminal behavior, to pin a label on something, the better to dismiss it without having to think about it. Now, there's a certain irony here, because the most frequently invoked juridical notion in the United States at every juridical level, judicial level, whether it's local, municipal, county, state, or federal, is that of conspiracy. Every prosecutor is that in his primary arsenal: conspiracy to defraud, conspiracy to do this, to do that, to the other thing. Invariably, the charge of conspiracy is deployed by prosecutors to envelop people in state repression in the U.S. The only conspiracy in which they have vanishingly little interest is that which involves authority. But of course, what is conspiracy but two people in consort deciding to do something in common? And there's a certain irony about this, because there is no single example of a major imperial project or onslaught on the part of U.S. rulers that did not involve what we call a false flag operation. Whether it's the bombing of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898, when U.S. rulers aspired to take the Philippines and Cuba from Spain. They blew up a ship in the U.S. Pentagon or military, blew up a ship in Havana Harbor and ascribed that to Spanish agents, and they had their casus belli. And that has defined every major such adventure, whether in World War I, when with the sinking of the Lusitania, they transmitted the coordinates of the ship to German High Command, and so on. And we move along these lines to the Pearl Harbor event, which the major authorities in the United States, from Brzezinski to Dov Zakheim, Rabbi Zakheim of the Pentagon, to Condoleezza Rice, we said we need a catalytic event of catastrophic nature to create the climate for carrying out a host of such policies, like Pearl Harbor. This is part of the predicate for what is called the Project for the New American Century. And of course, with respect to Pearl Harbor, the plans for Pearl Harbor were known to the U.S. authority for 6 months prior. Soviets had broken the Japanese code. The United States had all the particulars. You know, U.S. imperialism was cutting off Japanese imperium from rubber and from oil and from resources because it was a contest for control of East Asia. Pearl Harbor is a primary example of this sort of thing. And then, of course, if you recall, in 1962, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyman Limnitzer, prepared a document that was signed off on by all the members of the Joint Chiefs. This is not the wet dream of some marginal right-wing Looney Tune. The project, which then came to be known fortuitously when it got through in some documents released about another subject, namely some of the ancillary material on the Kennedy execution, and a man named James Bamford, a journalist who was the co-producer of the ABC News Tonight with Peter Jennings, the Canadian journalist. And he's visiting some of this material released under the JFK Act, and he finds something called Operation Northwood. Operation Northwood calls for planes being crashed into buildings in the United States, the murder of U.S. citizens in Washington, D.C. and in Miami, It anticipates the downing of the rocket carrying the astronaut John Glenn, all of which is to be imputed to the Cuban Revolution and to Fidel Castro as a casus belli for a total and immediate invasion of Cuba, Operation Northwood. This went up to the Kennedy brothers through McNamara. The Kennedy brothers said, you know, this is along the lines of what we have in mind, but it's a little, our hand is will be too transparent here. Give us something else. And they came up with such scenarios as dressing U.S. Special Forces in Cuban uniforms and attacking Guantanamo. Now, the Kennedy brothers ultimately didn't sanction Operation Northwoods for their own particular reasons, which we can discuss. And he was dead 12 months later. But there's no question as to what is the nature of Operation Northwood, you see? Or the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is about what? A fictive event in which U.S. destroyers are in Vietnamese territorial waters and they invent a presumptive assault upon a U.S. ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, which never happened. Nobody's in dispute about that. That's the casus belli which Johnson uses to begin the saturation bombing in Indochina. You see, it's not sui generis, the events of 9/11. It's every time that the authorities have to sell to the American people a long-standing operation involving extended, massive military undertakings, invasions, occupations, protracted war, they need a pretext. That's the history, that's the record, that's the overwhelming, massive characteristic of what a tiny predatory ruling class has to do to sustain its power. We have but 1% of the population in the United States that owns more than 95% of the combined wealth of the rest of the population. The former president of Avis and American Express, Robert Townsend, in his book, Up the Organization, calculated that approximately 5,000 people control what he called the commanding heights of the United States economy. They average 14 corporate directorships per individual. And he writes rather graphically that they look upon the country as their private whorehouse, and each president for them is a personal towel boy. This is not rhetoric. This is a structure of power. And this ruling class that comprises such a handful of people, concentrated power over the means of production, their country, the United States, has 5% of the world's population within its frontiers, but this handful of people has command over 70% of the world's resources. That is an empire by any standard. And that's the context with which you have to understand, with which we have to examine such phenomena as the attacks of September 11, 2001. The category of terror has become the rationale of the United States ruling class for a state of permanent war and a measure of repression that rends the facade of formal bourgeois democracy in the United States. An ultimate conspiracy theory has been propounded by U.S. rulers to the point of patent absurdity. More powerful than the Soviet Union, more dangerous than 50,000 H-bomb bearing intercontinental ballistic missiles, more imminent and omnipresent than the communist menace Shazam. It's Osama bin Laden from his cave in Afghanistan. This tiny oligarchy that comprises the United States ruling class contrived the category of terror with deliberation in the 1970s. And by the way, it flows, apropos our discussion last night about the hidden history of Zionism, from a particular document prepared by Oded Yinon in a publication called Kivinum. Oded Yinon is a Mossad operative called A Strategy for the 1980s, which postulated the necessity to fragment each Middle Eastern and Central Asian country ad seriatim into their ethnic and religious components, while demonizing the populace and its leadership as terrorists to create a rationale for sustaining imperial control and for stabilizing and advancing the aspiring occupations of the Zionist state itself. So this category of terror, which is in a sense the ideological replacement for the menace of communism and of subversion to justify and sell the necessity for massive military outlay. You know, the Great Depression in the 1930s had never been resolved by U.S. capitalism. By the second term of Franklin Roosevelt, late second term, 1938, you had 17.2% of the workforce unemployed. It was more devastating than 1929. What did they do? In a nutshell, they put people to work for the merchants of death. That percentage of the population that had been unemployed was now deflected into the production of arms, and capitalism became addicted to arms like an addict needing his fix and in ever-increasing doses. In 40 years, $10 trillion, official for the Pentagon. That's more than the combined value of everything taken together produced in the United States in this period. And on September 10th, 2001, Dan Rather of CBS announced that the Pentagon had lost $2.3 trillion the year previous, and the year prior to that, $1.9 trillion. How do you lose that kind of money? Robert Lieberman, the General Accounting Office, which I'll discuss, when he had to testify before Congress, talked about $7.2 trillion without a paper trail. You know, $1 trillion is $1,000 a minute since the birth of Jesus. They are cannibalizing the infrastructure of our society. This is a system in terminal decay. And you cannot sell, if you like, warrant, justify, convey the necessity for such predation, 60 countries, permanent war, without some demonic menace to present the category of terror. So they do this with deliberation, and they use it to demonize resistance to U.S. imperial designs in dependent countries and to suppress opposition at home. In reality, the Pentagon, the Central Intelligence Agency, and associate agencies organize, directed, and finance real terror groups among the far-right killer militia that they deploy across Latin America and Africa, death squads murdering and torturing hundreds of thousands of trade union leaders, students, peasant activists across the world, trained at the School of the Americas on an ongoing basis. So this tiny ruling class makes and conceals their policies in boardrooms and think tanks and clandestine councils of state. And whatever the vicissitudes of daily and yearly political life in the United States and beyond, this rapacious ruling class depends on a vast military and intelligence apparatus to sustain its rule. And late capitalism is wholly and entirely dependent on that pump priming deficit financing that sustains military production in the United States, even as they are, as I say, cannibalizing the infrastructure in our society. Now, 69 million people who live at what is called poverty level in the United States. Poverty level is $14,000, $14,400 for a family of four. You think that one member of that family can be sustained on $4,000-something a year? $7 a day? You can't buy a sandwich for that. The immiseration of our population is vast. It's much more substantial. The numbers are much larger than these official figures. This is a society in the throes of crisis. 9/11 is a direct expression of that. So we have to understand that the rape of human productive capacity and resources that fund the Pentagon and 14 intelligence agencies and sustain U.S. imperial control and capitalist dominion at home needs this rationale. Now, there was an interview on September 12th between a FEMA official named Tom Kennedy on CBS News and Rather. And Rather was questioning him about FEMA's preparation for such things as the attack. And Kennedy said, well, we were very well prepared. We were, to cope with such a calamity, we were there on September 10th, which is pretty good detective work even in Washington. The San Francisco Chronicle reported on September 12th with the headline, Willie Brown got early warning about air travel, that Mayor Willie Brown canceled his flight plans after receiving a call from, quote, our security people, advising him that he couldn't travel on September 11th. The Chronicle reported on September 14th that former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz received a memo on September 7th from State Department Intelligence the week before advising that Americans would be the target of major attacks on buildings within days and that he must adjust his travel plans accordingly. All members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff canceled all travel plans, by the way, in advance for September 11th. They had a Ouija board that they worked. The series of these events prompted the Chronicle to run a further story with the headline, How Could the United States Not Have Known? A 5-column headline in the San Francisco Chronicle. It cited the specific prior history and the advisories to the U.S. government of the attacks of September 11th by the Indian intelligence services. MSNBC reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin confirmed to embassy that his government had warned the United States well in advance and in the strongest terms of imminent attacks on airports and government buildings. Reports in Russian newspapers detailed the information, notice of specific attacks involving 25 pilots, no less. Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Germany's largest newspaper, reported that German intelligence had monitored in advance specific operational plans for September 11th and alerted U.S. authorities. David Wise, an author who has specialized in writing about U.S. intelligence operations, notably what we call false flag operations, imputed to groups run by the CIA, wrote an extended critique in the Los Angeles Times called Omens of Terror. Quote, 3 separate instances in the 1990s, he stated, foretold how such, quote, terrorists, unquote, will use airlines to strike at American targets. He specifies 3 distinct plans and plots to use airplanes as flying bombs to target buildings and people, operations known to U.S. intelligence, he writes, prior to the September 11th events. So in that past year, there were multiple reports from around the world that showed that the calamity of September 11th was an operation in the long tradition of provocations contrived to facilitate long-standing plans for war and conquest. And then I mentioned James Bamford and the discovery of Operation Northwoods. That, as I mentioned, is the little continuation of these types of plans. Now, Operation Northwoods and the Gulf of Tonkin and the induced, quote, invasion of Kuwait that precipitated the first Gulf War, and then the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993 and 2001, represent casus belli of their own design for the purpose of terrorizing the American people into numbed acquiescence in long-prepared plans of U.S. imperial design. On the first anniversary of September 11th, Richard Bernstein in the New York Times provided an account of how Mohammed Atta had, quote, met Ramzi Youssef, a key recruit for the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. The article labels the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center the linchpin of September 11th. Mohammed Atta is designated as, quote, the boss of the September 11th attacks, unquote. Now that's most instructive. The bombing of 1993 was ascribed by U.S. authorities to followers of a blind Egyptian cleric who had himself been involved early in the CIA's Operation Cyclone in Egypt. We find, however, that the person who organized the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, Ahmad Ali Salem, was in fact both an Egyptian intelligence agent and a long-standing and current operative of the Federal Bureau of Investigation based in New York. Ahmad Ali Salem, under FBI direction, proposed the bombing, prepared it, and recruited people to the operation on a need-to-know basis. He entered the mosque in New Jersey and in Brooklyn as the blind Egyptian cleric, and he recruited youngsters. Come to meetings. He'd say, you know, the Fedayeen in Egypt have to sell their kidneys for coin. Who is responsible for this condition? He says, while our people die and are terrorized and subjugated and exploited and submerged, we sit here idly? Why, he said, we should blow up the Brooklyn Bridge, the George Washington Tunnel, George Washington Bridge, the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel, the Statue of Liberty, the United Nations. Half the kids would look at this guy and they'd leave. Others were fascinated. Who is this character? He wore a wire to every one of these meetings that he set up. And then he made transcripts that filled 50 file boxes for a period of 6 months in the offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in New York. It was later established that the person who secured the rental van and organized the apartment where the preparations occurred was a person named Ghuzi Hadas, a Mossad operative. Ahmad Ali Salem would complain, as reported in the New York Times, that he had been, this is after his unexpected arraignment, he said he had been assured by his superiors in the FBI that the explosives that were supplied for this government operation would not detonate. There's no ambiguity about this. He claimed to have been unaware that these explosives would detonate with the consequent destruction, loss of life, over 200 people severely injured, and so on, collapse of sectors of the World Trade Center. See, the hands of the FBI and the Mossad are all over the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, as indeed they are over the events of September 11th. Now, Arnaud de Boisgrave, the editor-at-large of the United Press International, published an extended report by General Gul Hamid, the head of the International Inter-Services, the ISI, in Pakistan, Pakistan's de facto behind-the-scenes government since 1948. The ISI, effectively, with CIA, was running not just Pakistan. They were running the operations in Afghanistan, in particular, after you had Marxist governments in Kabul that had distributed the land to the peasants, removed the restrictions upon women, and were challenging the hegemony of the warlords in the north and what have you. And so Zbigniew Brzezinski, as he writes in the Grand Chessboard, they began to recruit Islamic fundamentalists to organize in units to stage attacks within Afghanistan, but not merely there. In the republics of the then Soviet Union, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, to destabilize. And Brzezinski calls it the bear trap, to entice the Soviet army into Afghanistan. $6 to $8 billion officially at that time allocated to Osama bin Laden and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. I know Gul Hamid. I was sitting down with Gul Hamid at one point and I said, tell me, what is the actual CIA funding of these operations? $6 to $8 billion? He says, $50 billion, my dear sir. This is not a small matter. So it was in part to the good offices of General Gul Hamid that the terror, quote-unquote, apparatus of Osama bin Laden and Gul bin Hikmet Yar was created by the Central Intelligence Agency. This man knows what he's dealing with. He was a primary instrumentality for many of these years. It was via the ISI and Gul Hamid that the Taliban were organized and funded and placed in power by CIA in Afghanistan. So those now so demonized as terrorists were long under the direction of U.S. intelligence. Their units were and remain penetrated by U.S. operatives such as Ahmad Ali Salem. Fox News carried a 4-part series documenting Mossad operations in the United States involving 200 agents, 60 based in the environments of Hollywood, Florida, 4 houses down from Mohammed Atta, who they were monitoring and running, 1 group of Mossad operatives just adjacent to Mohammed Atta's residence. ABC's 2020 detailed Operation Odigo, wherein the Mossad, under the cover of a moving company, set up operations across the World Trade Center, monitoring and filming the World Trade Center for hours prior to and during the attacks upon it. The Israeli newspaper Yediot Haranot published an article on September 14th describing how the Shavak stopped Prime Minister Ariel Sharon from traveling to New York on September 11th. Haaretz reveals on the same day, quote, the Federal Bureau of Investigation involving the arrest of 5 Israelis 4 hours after the attack of the Twin Towers, filming since early morning from the roof of their company building, describes them as videotaping the disaster amid cries of joy and mockery. Well, the Israeli companies that were stationed at 9/11 all had heads up. Their personnel were advised not to show. The Sunday Telegraph in London reported that Israeli intelligence officials discussed these attacks in New York and Washington in August. It specifies 2 Mossad experts who held meetings on these plans with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, in his interview with United Press International and Arnaud de Bourgegrave, who was the head of UPI and formerly an editor of Newsweek, by the way, a man with his own CIA credentials, Gul Hamid stunned Arnaud de Bourgegrave. Quote, it's very clear. There was a plot by the United States Air Force officers. The Twin Towers were first attacked at 8:45 a.m. 4 flights were diverted from their assigned airspace. Yet Air Force jets did not scramble, which is standard procedure, until 10 a.m. I know these operations. You guys trained me. This was the Mossad with its U.S. accomplices. The United States spends $40 billion on intelligence control and monitoring. I know this well, $400 billion. 10 years, little escapes them. This administration is telling us it was taken by surprise. Don't believe it. Within 10 minutes of the second Twin Tower being hit, CNN announced that Osama bin Laden had done it. Look, I'm in intelligence. This is a typical piece of planned disinformation by the real perpetrators. It creates an instant mindset. It puts public opinion in a trance that prevents even intelligent people from thinking for themselves, he writes or states. What about bin Laden, insists Arnaud de Bourgegrave. From a cave inside a mountain, from a peasant's hovel. He can't communicate anywhere. He can't break wind without it monitored by surveillance, the Central Intelligence Agency, overhead spy satellites. He does not have the capacity for so sophisticated an operation. 4 flights diverted from their assigned airspace. Not one air controller sounding the instant alarm. In Pakistan, if there is no response to IFF, which is friend or foe identification, jets are instantly scrambled. This is computerized. The aircraft is shot down. No further questions asked. You're talking about the Pentagon. It's interdicted space. The heart of the financial center in New York City. Are you serious? This is an inside job, he says. We're talking about the White House. Gul Hamid elaborates on how the Pentagon's quest for massive funds and U.S. conquest of Central Asian oil without opposition was unthinkable before September 11th. Now, his successor as director of ISI was General Mahmoud Ahmad, who was in Washington in the week preceding September 11th, where he met over several days with the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Pentagon. And then he goes down to Florida and meets with Porter Goss, the congressman there. Well, why Porter Goss? He became the Central Intelligence Agency director shortly thereafter. And with Robert Graham, the Democratic senator. While that is happening, through General Mahmoud's office, $100,000 is transferred into the account of Mohammed Atta. The disclosure of this by BBC and the Hindustani Times in New Delhi. And General Mahmoud is forced to resign. This takes us to another place, and I'm not going to go into the particulars here, but I can say to you from first-hand knowledge that General Mahmoud was set up. He's the fall guy here. But that's, in a certain sense, secondary. Well, now, who is Mohammed Atta, and who were his associates? In a flurry of reports in the Washington Post, Newsweek, and night-written newspapers, it was established that at least 6 of the, quote, terrorists were in training at high-level U.S. military facilities. Newsweek. U.S. military sources have confirmed that 5 of the, quote, terrorists, including Mohammed Atta, were cleared through and in training at secure U.S. military installations. Mohammed Atta at the International Officers School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. Abdulaziz Al-Amari, his training at the Aerospace School at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. Saeed Ahmadi at the Defense Language Institute of the Defense Intelligence Agency in Monterey, California. The presence of U.S. military intelligence permeates the events of September 11th. These accused terrorists had all given at various times an address at the Pensacola Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, and were cleared through U.S. Air Force International Officers School. Newsweek's George Wefritz, Catherine Skip, and John Barry concluded 5 of the alleged hijackers of these planes used in Tuesday's terror attacks were in training at secure U.S. military installations, unquote. The BBC Washington correspondent Tom Carver reported on October 11, 2002. The U.S. targets the entire Middle East. Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are next. The intellectual underpinning comes from Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense. It is shared by his boss, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, by Vice President Cheney, and by the President. America, concludes the BBC, will use its military power all around the world. Before September 11th, these ideas never got beyond policy papers. September 11th has provided the opportunity to put this ideological agenda into practice, unquote. The Sunday New York Times Magazine cover story, September 22, 2002, entitled The Sunshine Warrior. It describes an important meeting at Fort Leavenworth in midsummer for the U.S. Army's, quote, new leaders, unquote. Army Chief of Staff General Eric K. Shinseki is quoted as follows. A young Pentagon analyst, Paul Wolfowitz, directed a secret assessment of the Persian Gulf that marked Iraq as a menace to American interests. This, Shinseki informed the assembled officers with everything but a drum roll, was in 1979, a dozen years before Desert Storm. Indeed, a detailed plan was prepared by the Israeli Mossad and the Department of Information, as I had indicated before. The program for the fragmentation of each Middle Eastern country into its ethnic components. The report was detailed and specific. Iraq is first. Rich in oil, internally torn, it is guaranteed as our initial target. The solution is even more important for us than Syria. Egypt will then be torn apart like a second Lebanon. The entire Arabian Peninsula is a matter for dissolution. The matter is inevitable, especially in Saudi Arabia, unquote. So this Oded Yinon plan is taken up by Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and Kenneth Armitage and Ronald Rumsfeld and Richard Cheney and by the Committee on the Present Danger. And these plans were analyzed fully in late 1978 by the Brookings Institution in a detailed study, U.S. Armed Forces, a Political Instrument, prepared for the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. And by the way, disclosing 215 times between 1946 and 1975 when U.S. forces were deployed for specific such objectives. Now, in my book, Iraq and Kuwait, A History Suppressed, the paper by Pentagon analyst Miles Ignotus. Miles Ignotus is a nom de plume for Edward Luttwak of the Defense Intelligence Agency. In 1975, he prepares a paper called Seizing Arab Oil, describing the rapid deployment and strike force in preparation to seize Saudi oil fields, installations, and airports. And the London Sunday Times confirmed on February 9, 1975, the National Security Council has compiled a detailed review of a top-secret Department of Defense plan for the invasion of Saudi oil fields, the plan code named Dahran Option 4, drawn up by the Pentagon, providing for a U.S. attack on oil fields that contain 40% of the world-known reserves. Intelligence and military analyst Robert Tucker addresses the feasibility of seizing Arab oil by direct military intervention in a piece in January 1975 entitled Oil, the Issue of American Intervention. Without intervention, he writes, there is the distinct prospect of an economic and political disaster bearing more than a superficial resemblance to that disaster of the 1930s. He then describes secret U.S. plans of long-standing for, quote, intervention in an area which, when effectively controlled, will provide us with sufficient portion of present world oil production and proven reserves, and will introduce the breaking of the present price structure and the core of the cartel politically and economically. The Arab shoreline of the Gulf, he concludes breathlessly, is a new El Dorado awaiting its conquistador. Some of these imperialists can wax poetic. By 1979, Lawrence Mosher had formulated, quote, the plan circulating in Pentagon and Washington corridors. What military people called the U.S. 100,000-man quick strike force rapidly deployed anywhere. But, as a top Pentagon official stated, we need a real boogeyman to come in and have to be stopped before we can talk of using the strike force. It may be that this boogeyman will not translate the same in Arabic as in English, unquote. The stratagems of U.S. imperialism worked out in each decade bear a striking similarity to their antecedents. Here's Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor under Carter, in a book, as I mentioned, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives, 1997. It's remarkable in its candor. U.S. global primacy is directly dependent on how long and effectively our preponderance on the Eurasian continent is sustained by force. The power that dominates Eurasia will control two of the world's three most advanced and economically productive regions. Most of the world's physical wealth is there, both in its enterprises and underneath its soil. Eurasia accounts for 60% of the world's GNP and about 75% of the world's known energy resources. It is our primary target. Brzezinski spells out the object of U.S. and imperial policy. Quote, the Eurasian Balkans are infinitely more important as an economic prize with enormous concentration of natural gas and oil reserves in the region. The Central Asian region, the Caspian Sea Basin, contain reserves of natural gas and oil that dwarf those of Kuwait, Gulf of Mexico, and North Sea combined. For over a decade, the major think tanks of U.S. corporate capital prepared for the seizure of oil and natural gas of Central Asia and of the Caspian Sea basin. The U.S. Energy Information Administration prepared a series of studies over several years calculating the return from direct U.S. seizure of Central Asian oil. Here's a report. By 2020, the U.S. will import 64% of its crude oil, 5.8 million barrels each day. Caspian region oil reserves, the third largest in the world, and within the next 15 years will offset Persian Gulf oil. Caspian Sea oil and gas are not the only hydrocarbon deposits in the region that we require. Turkmenistan's Karakum Desert holds the world's third largest gas reserves. Current estimates indicate that there are 3 trillion cubic meters, 6 billion barrels of oil reserves. In addition to huge gas deposits, there are as well 200 billion barrels of oil, 33 times the holdings of Alaska's North Slope, with a current short-term value gain to us of $4 trillion, unquote. U.S. News and World Report cites a private memo to oil industry executives from Vice President Richard Cheney in 1998 in his capacity as CEO of Halliburton. I cannot think of a time when we have had a region emerge so suddenly to become as strategically and critically important to us as the Caspian. And interestingly enough, the short-term gains from oil and natural gas resources have been calculated by U.S. News and World Report at $4 trillion. Here, Oil Politics, America and the Riches of the Caspian Basin, World Policy Journal, spring 1998. Here's Ian Bremmer examining the pipeline structure required to secure the proven oil reserves of $15 to $30 billion with reserves of $200 billion and proven natural gas reserves of 350 trillion cubic feet. We need this and we shall have it. In his report in the United States Heritage Foundation of July 25, 1997, Ariel Cohen does a calculation of these resources. $4 trillion at current market prices, then he estimates a bonanza, and that's current market prices. You know what oil was at that time? What, $18 a barrel? You have an understanding of the exponential, what these people are doing? You know, they fight wars over these things. They kill. Ariel Cohen does a calculation. A bonanza in the region's reserves, similarly enormous, larger than all those in North America. Under the heading A Silk Road Blueprint, he urges creation of conditions in Afghanistan where we can undertake rapid construction of the pipeline to carry this bonanza of profiteering to the Indian Ocean. The same theme sounded by UNICAL Vice President John Maresca, former U.S. Ambassador for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, these reports of the Council on Foreign Relations, the U.S. Afghanistan Foundation, the Energy Information Office, the Central Intelligence Agency outlined the strategic necessity for the United States to create the pretext and conditions for seizing control of these resources and the generation of now $5 trillion in short-term profits for the oil companies involved. Chevron, Unical, Mobil, and BP had already divided up percentages along lines mapped out in the San Remo agreements of 1922, when the oil of the Middle East was divided amongst the oil companies and the governments they directed. Now, U.S. rulers have stated that they have 60 countries in their sights. Permanent war over the next 40 to 50 years, quote, that will not end in our lifetimes or the lifetimes of our children, quote unquote, James Woolsey. As the capitalist economy falters, as the rapacious U.S. ruling class dismantles the gains of working people representing a century of struggle, the destruction of workers' rights, the ravaging of remaining democratic achievements of the 18th century bourgeois democratic revolution, these unfold relentlessly and rapidly. As workers resist, as strikes are sustained, as mass disaffection increases, so will the repression of our rulers. It is not the evil that is new, nor is it the crisis that has changed. It is rather the human cost of capitalist rule in our era, as in others, is measured in mass murder and unbridled destruction. Now, in his book, Clouds of Secrecy, Leonard Cole, public health professor at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, New Jersey, formerly of the U.S. biological weapons facilities at Fort Detrick, Maryland, documented what the New York Times acknowledged were 239 cities and locations in the United States where the Pentagon, over a period of 40 years now, has released clandestinely hundreds of trillions of bacilli, bacteria, fungi, and spores. In his introduction, the late Senator Alan Cranston of California acknowledged that over 10 million U.S. citizens were affected. These biological agents were deployed by the Pentagon in the subway system of New York, the school systems of Minneapolis and St. Louis. In the Bay Area of San Francisco and environs, spinal and brain meningitis increased by tenfold as a result of this secret assault upon U.S. citizens. Yet, not a day goes by when our rulers fail to declaim that these demonic terrorists are preparing to release biological agents in our water supply, our nuclear plants, and to spread everything from smallpox to anthrax. In the presidential debates, in the Democratic presidential debates, Charles Osgood, the ABC lead correspondent who was hosting those debates, confronted the Democratic candidates and stated, you know, the reports now are overwhelming. There is inevitably going to be an attack with nuclear weapons within the United States by the terrorists. And the primary consideration is, what are we going to do now to stop this, and what are we going to do the day after? And I want you to respond. And then he cited a whole set of data, nominally from the National Intelligence Counterterrorism Services, to the effect that there was a 40% chance, increased to 60% likelihood, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, every single figure from Joseph Biden to Hillary Clinton to Barack Obama stated, of course, we are going to, the question of the terrorists, we are going to stop them in their tracks. We will make sure that we use and undertake measures within the United States to address this. You know what those entail? Like executive order of George Bush on July 17th, 2007, which stipulates that any individual who challenges or undermines or countervenes U.S. economic and political policy, be it in Iraq or elsewhere, is subject to immediate detention without due process or entitlement to counsel, as a violator of national security, with their property to be seized, their bank accounts, their homes, the clothes on their back. And if they so much as notify a family member or a friend, and they are lent a jacket or $10 for a taxi cab, or the use of a car, those individuals are subject to the same penalties. Well, that's a formal executive order put in place, and without a mumbling word from any member of that millionaires club called Congress. It's but the little continuation of the preparations for martial law that are an advanced and proclaimed preparation in the United States, with the Northern Command assigned control and jurisdiction over every city within 200 miles of the coast of the United States, with the Armageddon plan that was published on the front page of the Atlantic Monthly, for command headquarters to set up to run this country with intelligence and military control by decree. the people of the United States are indeed being terrorized by our own degenerate ruling class. For this is the true gravamen of September 11th and of barbarous attacks yet to be unleashed by our rulers. The American working class has not been crushed in our country. It has never suffered a generalized defeat. They have had trial runs, as in Katrina, where martial law was declared in an area that is larger than the territory of Great Britain, where 70,000 thugs with Blackwater were unleashed, where what is euphemistically called spatial deconcentration was inflicted upon African American working class inhabitants of the region. See? What the Army Times called Little Somalia, as they cut it off from any access to material aid or sustenance or support. As they put people in sports stadia and locked them in there. A dry run indeed. They've been promising us and guaranteeing to us that there are going to be biological attacks across the United States and North America. We did an 8-part series called The Pending Pandemic, Forging the Next Pandemic, a System in Terminal Decay, on Taking Aim. It outlines all of this, from Ebola to SARS to emergent viruses, as they are weaponized in grade 4 and grade 5 labs across the United States. Because this ruling class is confronted by a population that has seen through it very clearly. Now, something like 75 to 80% of the population wants the war in Iraq ended. As much as 70% is convinced that the United States authorities had a role in the events of 9/11. Do you know that the Financial Times reports that since January, $33 trillion have been lost in the bourse, stock markets, as a consequence of this deep and endemic structural crisis afflicting capital? These rulers understand that. The American working class at the point of production retains the ability to organize and to resist, and this ruling class knows that too. There is no system so totally incapable of meeting the elementary needs of people that has been able to sustain itself over any protracted period of time. But the human costs will not be minor. We have the opportunity and the obligation, as we put it in the United States, to break with the one big property party with two names and to forge a political instrument of our own. The word remains important, and we will not shrink from a clear and precise exposure of the perfidy of our rulers. There's massive documentation of their undertaking of 9/11, all the parameters of its implementation, chapter and verse. But the prerequisite for an independent, working class, political mobilization is before us. As Rosa Luxemburg enjoined in the beginning, was the deed. And I think that the lesson that we are drawing across the United States, and I think it's as relevant here in Canada, in all of North America, is that we cannot persuade these rulers. We can't change them. We can't reform them. And we can't contain them. We have to overthrow them. We have to remove them. We have to build a movement of the many, conscious of what is at risk and what is at stake, to break with the captains of capital and to build a movement to displace them and throw them in the dust can of history where they belong. That is the gravamen of the events of September 11th, which are ongoing. September 11th is the little continuation of past imperial policy and the predicate for what will follow. They promise us every week a new such catastrophe. They've assured us that it will happen within this next year. They continually do that to impose numbing fear and acquiescence and repressive measures, which are legion. I want to just close by referring to what was called the political bombshell from who? Of all people, Zbigniew Brzezinski. He appeared before the United States Congress and he said, "There's a three-word mantra of lies that has undermined America. We have been terrorized by these three words, and it is called a war on terror." And he stipulates in his testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the Bush administration was going to stage a pretext operation to prepare for its long-standing plans to attack Iran. The same plans, by the way, that Barack Obama embraced in 2004 when he called for a preemptive missile strike on Tehran, that he elaborated upon in 2007, amplifying it by saying we should include Pakistan while we're at it. The brother of John Kerry, Mark Kerry, going to Tel Aviv during the 2004 campaign to attack Bush for not being supportive enough of Ariel Sharon and the planned Zionist assault upon Damascus and Tehran. And here is Brzezinski describing to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that we are on the verge of a historic, strategic, and moral calamity undertaken under false assumptions, which will devastate our global legitimacy with vast casualties and abuses that will tarnish us forever, driven by Manichaean principles and imperial hubris of intensifying and regional and global instability and devastation, and of a memorandum that has not heretofore been disclosed. The president, says Brzezinski, is cited as stating that he is concerned that they are unable to sustain the claim of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that we will have to provide a different basis for undertaking this action, with which Tony Blair concurs. And then Brzezinski says, I will read to you what this memo states. The President and Prime Minister acknowledge that there are no unconventional weapons in Iraq, and therefore they must provide a something dramatic to provoke a confrontation. They are quite sensational, these ways, says Brzezinski. Brzezinski is one of the architects of all of this. A spokesperson for a sector of the rulers that looks at the current plans as reckless endangerment of the sustainability of American imperialism. The timing is wrong. Whatever they represent, they are faced with a calamitous, imminent defeat in Iraq. To contemplate the now extension of this to Iran, extending U.S. forces on a scale that requires massive repression at home, not yet. But I say to you that we cannot look to this gang for relief or for resort or for response or for answers to this crisis for humanity. That is our task. That is our task. We have to be clear about the character of late capitalism, the disaster that it is inflicting on humankind, the real significance of September 11th and the terror events that will be imposed in the near future, and to alert, mobilize, and prepare our people for the struggles ahead. It's not the evil that is new, nor is it the crisis that has changed. This generation is confronting the necessity to pose the question of who rules. This criminalized ruling class, or people long oppressed and long denied, whose time has come. Let's talk.